All right. Our next video lecture focuses in on cognitive psychotherapy. And this is still a continuation of Unit 5 on therapy and positive psychology. And today's focus is on Module 5.5b, Part 2. So looking at the goal of the cognitive perspective believes that our thoughts, our beliefs, our perspectives need to change in order to change the behavior that we experience. So they believe kind of somewhere in between an event happening and the response we feel or we say lies the mind. And in there is our beliefs and our thoughts. And that's what we need to focus in on, because that's where the anxiety, the depression, fill in the blank comes from. So the goal is to change what's happening in between the event and our response, change that negative thinking to a more constructive way of interpreting an event. And if we can do that, that individual is going to live a much happier and more fulfilled life. So one of the fathers of this perspective is a man named Aaron Beck. And Aaron Beck believed in what he called the cognitive triad. And so he thought specifically when you look at individuals who are depressed, with individuals who have major depression or persistent depression, what happens is that their thinking changes in three important ways that negatively impact the individual and becomes almost like this negative trifecta cycle that's very difficult to get out of. And so this cognitive triad included three different important ways that our overall beliefs and thinking changed. The first thing that changes is our thoughts about ourselves. We start to have a lower self-esteem. We start to perceive our worth is not as high. Individuals who are depressed see themselves as a failure. So the view, the thoughts, the belief, the interpretations of self. The second one is the interpretations about the world. How do we interpret relationships and events? We tend to, individuals with depression, this cognitive triad, tend to see the world as a hostile or unfair place. They see that this world is not positive. This world doesn't have a lot of good things to offer. And third, their thoughts about the future are negatively impacted. So this is kind of where we look at like the optimism or pessimism about the future. And so individuals with depression, their futuristic thoughts sees the future as hopeless, sees that nothing is ever going to get better, sees that their future self isn't any better than their current self. And so kind of this trifecta of thoughts about ourselves, about our future, and about the world around us, all they do is feed into each other to make the opposite one, or to make the next one worse. So if we believe there's no hope for our future, well, then we obviously have no hope for today. So we feel like we've failed because we've failed our future, because our current is not even good. If we view the world and others around us as not caring, if we interpret people's intentions as negative all the time, well, then we're going to feel worse about ourselves and we're going to feel worse about our future. So we kind of get caught in this terrible cognitive triad. And so what we want to do is we want to try and get individuals out of this depressive dark glasses, this depressive cognitive triad, and we want to get them to start to perceive the world, themselves, and their future much different. And so we want to change this negative view by using a technique called cognitive restructuring. And so in order to do this, the first thing that we have to do is identify what are some of the cognitive distortions. What are some of those big beliefs that individual has either about themselves, their future, or the world? And so we will go in class and we will take a look at all the different types of cognitive distortions that individuals experience. And I'm sure you're going to find some cognitive distortions that you hold and believe are true in your head that is getting you into a negative headspace in that trifecta. But the first task in cognitive restructuring is we have to first identify, we have to figure out what are those cognitive distortions? What are those really embedded beliefs and thoughts that we have about our environment, our future, and ourselves? Once we identify them, then the goal is to challenge those. And this is really, a lot of this is on the therapist to use a lot of questioning, to use strategies such as examining evidence for and against the belief, asking questions to identify the validity of that inherent belief that they had, asking them how other people might interpret that same situation or that same thing that they're having that about, and slowly try and help them see the errors in that cognitive distortion. Once they can get there, the next step is to replace those. So once we get rid of those negative thoughts, we have to have something to replace them with. We have to have a realistic and alternative thought to put in there. So when our brain goes naturally to the negative cognitive distortion about our future, about ourselves, or about the world, we need to have something to replace it with. Because if we don't replace it with something, then it's going to just be so easy. If we look at, our neural networks, it's going to be so easy for all neural networks to just connect right back to that automatic cognitive distortion or negative thought process. So something needs to replace that and be practiced to remake those neural networks. And then finally, it's going to need to be reviewed. We're going to need to regularly assess the effectiveness of this, utilizing different techniques in order to practice with that more realistic alternative thought and make sure that that is actually working. And so we'll do a little bit more of this kind of practice in class. Finally, there is a combination, a common eclectic, meaning eclectic, remember, is when you combine two or more perspectives together. But one of the most common eclectic approaches is called CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy. I'm guessing that you probably maybe have heard of this before you came in here. Maybe not, but now that you've heard of it, I'm sure you are going to see it in more places. But this is exactly what it sounds like, a combination of cognitive and behavioral perspective. So in this kind of therapy, the goal is to address the negative thinking, to change those, as well as to teach them new behavioral responses to those. So within that, there are two different techniques that we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about REBT, or Rational-Emotive Behavioral Therapy, and Dialectical Behavioral Therapies. And so in general, in CBT, we want to change that irrational thinking. We want to train people to practice more positive approaches and essentially have a new lease on life. So the first technique is by a man named Albert Ellis, and he created what's called REBT, or Rational-Emotive Behavioral Therapy. So where in cognitive restructuring, we talked more about the ingrained beliefs about themselves, the future, and the world, REBT hones in on cognitively restructuring one specific way of thinking. And so they're going to look at maybe relationships for this individual, and what are the repetitive thoughts that person has with regards to this relationship with this one person or this one area of their life. It's more of a smaller focus. We're focusing in on one thought or one group of thoughts versus a larger belief about ourselves and the world around us. So in REBT, we're going to use a method called ABC. And A stands for activating event, meaning what happened. So on a simple level, my friend didn't say hi to me in the hallway. That's an event. Just what happened. C is the consequence. How do you feel in light of that event? So I feel sad, I feel rejected, or my friends went out without me, didn't even call to invite me to see if I was free. The consequence of that negative event, activating event, is I feel sad, I feel upset. Well, most of us in life believe that A causes C, that event is the reason I'm sad. Because my friends didn't invite me out, that is the reason I am upset and sad. And Albert Ellis comes in and he revolutionizes that, and he says, no. Events don't have that power. Rather, there's something that happens in between there, and that's the B, and that's our beliefs. And our beliefs are really what make us feel that way. So it's not that your friend didn't invite you out that made you feel sad. It's that you believe that they intentionally left you out, don't care about you, you're not important. That's why you feel upset. If somebody else had the same thing happen, that same activating event, the friend doesn't invite them, they might feel happy. Well, why would that person feel happy from that same situation? Well, we have to evaluate, what is their B? Perhaps their B was saying, oh, I know that they only had like 2 tickets to go. I think it's so exciting that they got to go to this concert and that they chose so-and-so to go to that concert with them. What a cool experience for them. I'm really excited for them. Their consequence, their emotion is joy, happiness. So if we can first, sift through the mud and figure out what are those events, what are those feelings, and then try and figure out, well, what are those beliefs that led us to those feelings? We then have something that we can trigger, that we have something that we can now go for, that we can try and adjust and to change. And so Ellis and others who use REBT, their job is to do the D of the ABC model. And the D is to dispute, where their job is to dispute those beliefs that that individual had that they believe leads to the consequence or emotion that they're experiencing. And so if they can challenge, criticize, adjust, find flaws in that belief about that situation, they can then change the feelings that that individual has. It's a really powerful technique. It's not always the most warm and fuzzy. You're identifying somebody's irrational beliefs, and sometimes it can be harsh to hear the challenges that Albert Ellis may utilize in order to get you to adjust that B. But I think, at least for me, this technique really just brings to light, when I'm experiencing emotions, pausing myself to think, is it really that event or that thing that happened? Is it that thing that my friend did? Or is it the thing that that student did? Or is it the thing that my husband did that's causing me to feel this way? And instead evaluate and say, well, what are my beliefs about that? What am I thinking about that? And how is it really my interpretation that's causing me to feel this way, not that actual event? And the final technique in CBT that we are going to go over is called dialectical behavioral therapies. So this is originally created for individuals with borderline personality disorder. And it was, obviously made for individuals who has really intense emotions, tend to have very impulsive behaviors, and difficulty with those interpersonal relationships. Again, all hallmarks of that borderline personality disorder. And so with dialectical behavioral therapies, or DBT, there is kind of a 4-step process in order to try and mend a rational mind with our emotional mind and put it together to create what's called a wise mind. And so there's 4 different steps to doing this. Those include mindfulness, self-tolerance or acceptance, emotional regulation, and interpersonal effectiveness. So starting first with mindfulness, this is all about acceptance. So the idea here is that we need to accept our triggers, be aware of our stress triggers, be aware of our feelings, be aware of the here and now and the present, and when something happens that upsets us, to be aware of those things. And we have to have this, what they call radical acceptance, that we need to recognize and accept that we have these feelings, right? We need to name the emotions that we feel. We need to identify the intensity of those feelings that we have. And it's not about necessarily changing those, it's changing how we react. And in order to change how we react, we first need to recognize that we have them and we need to accept them. Not saying we agree or we think that they're good, but we need to accept that those feelings happen for us. We have those stress triggers. The second step is the self-tolerance, the acceptance, the distress tolerance that's happening. And so one of the main pillars is to accept that pain is inevitable. Recognize that we're going to have triggers. We're going to feel pain in life. That's just inevitably what's going to happen in our life. And so the goal is, in this step, to help the person feel or be exposed to different types of stress, recognizing that we're going to have the pain, it's inevitable, but what can we do different as a response? So when we are exposed to stress, what are some techniques we could use in order to deal with the stress and pain that is inevitably going to happen to everybody in the world? And so during this piece, they're going to teach some different techniques like distraction, where you might do something else when you start to feel triggered. Maybe you hold an ice cube. Maybe you go do dishes. Maybe you go somewhere and cry. Maybe you write in a journal. Maybe you exercise. Maybe you go volunteer. But you do something else other than the negative techniques that you'd been using up until this point. So we are going to make sure that we feel that stress. We want to then practice self-tolerance. We want to practice accepting that pain and doing something that's different than what we normally do. The third step is emotional regulation, where we start to need to make changes, where we start to now understand how can we manage and understand our emotions. So this is where we're going to work more in the thought process. So how can we practice not jumping to conclusions? How can we slow down and evaluate our thoughts before we behave and act upon them? How can we label and build positive experiences by looking around and noticing positive things and interactions? And the more we notice one thing, hopefully the more we're going to notice multiple other things. We're going to try and find causes and effects. What are things that happen that cause the emotions or cause me to overreact? Be aware of what those triggers are for self-harm behavior, especially in the borderline patients. And find a way to let go of that guilt, those feelings, those emotions. Let go of them as a way to regulate yourself. Allow yourself to let go of them. And then finally, is the making changes. This is the interpersonal effectiveness stage. And this is where where a DBT therapist is going to help an individual learn how to communicate with themselves and with others, help them to get their needs met in a more healthy manner than what they had been doing prior to this. Again, this was created for individuals with borderline personality disorder. So how can you get your needs met with that fear of the instability or somebody leaving or being rejected? How can you get those needs met while maintaining a positive relationship with that individual and reacting in a way that is more likely to have a response that's going to help you? How can you assert yourself without getting too emotional or too angry? How can you work in conflict? How do you either help people who are too passive or too aggressive in order to respond differently to different situations? So big picture, acceptance. Accept that this is the feelings, the emotions, the experiences that you have, but how can we change them? How can we change our reactions? How can we change and deal with the emotions that we have? And how can we better make our relationships with each other? That is it for today. I hope you have a wonderful day.